Here he is. Hi, John.
Hey, Lynette, how's it going?
Good. How are you doing?
Pretty good. So thanks very much for having me on here.
Of course. It's always great to connect also with our local colleagues. So before I introduce you officially, John, I have a few remarks. Just to remind everyone that Busch Hall is our virtual space where we reimagine German art and identity through the lens of the Busch-Reisinger Museum. And this series, which we hold monthly on Wednesdays at noon or 1 p.m., depending on our guests' availability, is generously supported by our German friends of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, and we're very grateful for their support of this Instagram project. As we begin today's talk, the Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts people, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. And I'm thrilled to be here today with John A. Tyson, who is Assistant Professor of Art History at UMass Boston. You may be familiar with John's work. He's written extensively on modern and contemporary art, is a specialist also in American art, and has particular interests in conceptual art and technology, which means it's maybe not so surprising, John, that you landed in your work to focus also on the oeuvre of Hans Haacke.
Yeah, so Hans's work was the topic of my dissertation, and so I finished that in 2015, but I guess I kind of embarked on serious research in about 2010, and so I guess I got bitten by the Haacke bug and continued to be very interested in his work. And I'm currently working on a book manuscript that has a little bit to do with the dissertation, but is mostly new things.
Wow, that's exciting. When do you anticipate we'll have a chance to read your book?
So I'm still looking for a publisher. So I've sent out some proposals. I've not been rejected yet, so that's a good sign, I think. But I don't know an exact timeline, but hopefully in about 2 years' time, I think.
Well, that's great, and I do know that you're speaking this September in Montreal at the German Studies Association. Is that also going to be on your Haacke research?
Yes, so actually this is really great that you invited me to talk about Hans's We All Are the People, because that will be featured in the talk at the German Studies Association conference, and is also building towards one of the book chapters that's looking at the role of monuments and anti-monuments in Hans's work more broadly.
Well, it's great. And I mean, I knew I couldn't have asked a better scholar to speak to us about Haacke today. And actually, I should say that I came across your work because of an article you wrote on Haacke that specifically addresses the work I hope we can talk more in detail about today. We are all the people, because I'm in the plans for my special exhibition next year on German art and identity in art after 1980. I do plan to include that work by Hans Haacke in the exhibition as a kind of takeaway poster, which is how he's shown it in numerous iterations, and most recently in locally at Northeastern. Maybe you could say a little bit about that project, which I believe you were involved with.
So I think maybe I'm not aware of it being at Northeastern. So I'm at UMass. So I think maybe you're thinking about Gloria Sutton, who came and
That's
talked
right.
with Hans.
I apologize.
No,
That was
worries.
Gloria's exhibition.
So Gloria.
I'm conflating it because we met there for the first time.
Yes. Yep. So I think it was in the exhibition that Sam Toby and I organized that was looking at the legacies of the Whitney Independent Study Program, and Haacke. I think at least since the early 1980s, maybe even slightly longer, was and continues to be an instructor in that kind of alternative art school. And I think that perhaps is one of many important networks that he's kind of been plugged into throughout the years. And Gloria also did the same program. And Ida was an alum of it as well. And so that was the reason that we all came together. And the way that we showed it was as a stack, which I imagine you will do also, which of course conjures up the legacy of another Whitney Independent Study Program alumni, Felix Gonzalez Torres, who died tragically of AIDS, but is significantly younger than Hans Haacke. And so it's interesting to see how influence doesn't necessarily flow kind of in one direction, but could kind of move backwards and forwards in between different generations.
Yeah, that's a wonderful contextualization of that as well. Also for us at the Harvard Art Museums, we actually do have work by Gonzalez Torres in the collection, sadly not any work by Hans Haacke. So that's something that I'm also working on. I'm told that We All Are the People is not a work that one can acquire for a museum. So that was, of course, a disappointment to me, but I think maybe will become clear in our discussion today, maybe why Hans has that particular approach to this work. So maybe John, take us at first in some sort of broad strokes. I mentioned your interest in conceptual art, how your thinking around Haacke is maybe framed, and then we'll start to dig in to that particular work.
And I guess it maybe is worth just mentioning, as you've already alluded to, for people who are not familiar with Haacke's work and his longer trajectory, is that he's probably best known for works that engage with politics in some way. He's a really important figure for what's known as institutional critique. So this kind of subgenre of conceptual art, where artists kind of beginning in the late 60s start to think about making meta artworks that make you think about the definition of art, the institutions that art is presented in. And Haacke, importantly, kind of extends that kind of critique beyond just reflecting on the kind of raw materials of museums, the white cube, but also thinking about how corporate sponsorship might play a role in what types of things are shown in museums or how things are framed. So I think very important for the way that his work engages with not just aesthetics, but with also politics. And certainly the way that I think about his work, so the title of this book that I'm working on is Double Agents, which comes from a quote from the artist himself in the early 70s, where he thinks about his work being kind of framed and presented as art, but always having additional other kinds of functions, usually related to politics. And his career he started out as a printmaker, started then working in kind of non-traditional sculptural materials. Maybe some people saw Caroline Jones's 2011 remake of the 1967 Hans Haacke exhibition that had a really wonderful selection of these older works with liquids, with wind. And he moved from there to working more and more with different kinds of languages. And he's very interested, and hopefully we can talk specifically about this in relationship to We All Are the People, in kind of graphic design and citations, and reusing citations in perhaps kind of against the grain, to explore a whole range of different kinds of meanings.
Thank you. That was wonderful, and the kind of beautiful synopsis that only someone who's so steeped in the work can give. So in approaching Haacke's work, yourself then as as an artist and as a kind of double agent working on these kind of different modes, how do you see this particular work and its development over time sort of fitting into that large? I mean, you touched on a few key points, language, design, but specifically in the public realm, which was a bit maybe where you mentioned you're thinking about it in terms of monuments and anti-monuments. How does that play into this larger institutional social critique?
So I think it certainly merits kind of stepping back and thinking about where he's getting the phrase from. And he's doing a kind of slightly creative quotation. And so the term that I think about for his work often, and maybe encapsulates something of the way that it kind of pushes back against host sites, is as para-citations, or a kind of slightly improper kind of citation. And he's taking the English, so taking it or acknowledging a chant that was made famous by protesters in East Germany in the GDR, which was "We are the people," "Wir sind das Volk" in German, and then adding this "all" in parentheses, which is kind of a little interruption in that perhaps more smoothly chanted phrase. And one thing that he was worried about, so he'd initially thought about using this phrase in his artwork in a public memorial in Leipzig, which in front of the St. Nicholas Church, which is where these protests happened in the 1980s. And he then returned to it for Documenta 14 and shifted its format from being a kind of public light installation projected onto the facade of the church into being this poster that occupies public space in kind of an interesting way. It's filled up spaces that are, so when it was at Documenta, it operated as a banner, dialogue with kind of monumental architecture. It displaced advertisements. It's done the same thing in New York City as part of an initiative by Crew Mansueto Gallery called Titan, where it was on a phone booth. So it's kind of perhaps pushing things that normally transmit kind of explicit or clear commercial or political messages out of space. And maybe in this way, it's almost like the opposite of a kind of traditional Hans Haacke work, where you expect it to be in a museum, but talking about things in the outside world. This one is operating in public space, and maybe even, as you already alluded to, kind of pushing against the idea that it's even exactly art by the fact that he wouldn't let you collect it for the museum.
Yes, much to my dismay. And, you know, I have these visions of the bus stops around Cambridge, you know, with the poster. So we'll see how far we can take it next year as well. But it's, you know, it's interesting to think about that inversion. And I mean, it is wonderful to sort of track the shift also in medium. You mentioned it started as a light installation that used this same, you know, para phrasing or para quotation. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the context of that in Leipzig.
Yeah. So the reason that he, I think, was galvanized to go back to it is that a German far-right party, Pegida, or P-E-G-I-D-A, had taken on the using of the original phrase, the "We are the people," but rather than having it be about German reunification, it's a kind of anti-immigration position. And so it's reacting to the influx, particularly of Syrian refugees, that was being initially debated and then occurred in Germany in 2015. And this party has also undertaken perhaps tactics that are not so different to Haacke's in some ways, that they've been kind of doing this sort of mimesis of earlier protests, so specifically in East Germany. And so his parasitation perhaps almost is like a kind of homeopathic method in some ways. It's kind of wresting it, the phrase that has sort of liberatory potential, out of the hands of this far-right group.
And maybe we should mention as well that phrase was also used around the time of unification by many immigrants already living and working in Germany for many, many years in kind of argumentation for their own citizenship rights. Although it wasn't in the way that Haacke does it with the kind of all, it was often, wir sind auch das Volk, we are also the people. Do do you think he's aware of those mutations of the phrase also, because it's such a strongly loaded phrase at that time in particular?
Yes, I think he definitely is. I mean, he's a voracious consumer of media. So he reads. So even if he was in the United States, though traveling periodically back and forth to Germany, but he's someone who's very interested in German politics, keeps up with what's happening really all over the world. So a very active reader of news media. And so I think you're exactly right, that thinking about all of those kind of potential resonances, reworkings of the term are things that definitely would have been on his radar. And he famously does a similar operation with a quote that appeared in advertising for Saatchi and Saatchi, I think it was a corporate report actually, where they quote Lenin saying everything is connected to everything else, which seems like a kind of bizarre thing for Saatchi and Saatchi to be quoted. And then Haacke also tries kind of taking that back in one of his works. So this idea of everything being connected to everything else is certainly something that very much appeals to his sensibilities. So thinking about all kinds of possible kind of metaphorical resonances, linguistic resonances. He was interested in the way that Bolk might be engaged with kind of more ironically, because of course the Volkskammer, for instance, or the Volkspolizei are the official names of the Stasi and the GDR government. And so that Volk is even getting kind of deturned or sent in new directions when people are initially chanting it in favor of German reunification. And so I think that kind of sensibility definitely appeals to him, and he uses it as a tactic as well.
Yeah, and this idea then to, wrest it back from its use by far-right groups in Germany, but then also to not just, shift the phrase, but then also to present the phrase in all of these different languages. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I guess I would encourage folks who haven't seen it to either Google it or look at the posting that Lynette did, I guess a few weeks back, maybe even slightly longer, of the work. And it usually exists, I think, with 12 different languages, each one rendered in a slightly different font. And I think that there are kind of various things going on with this, right? That it's something that speaks to a kind of plurality of peoples who might make up the people, as opposed to there being kind of one authentic people.
Which would then speak German, I'm assuming. I mean, in the context that he's creating the work, right? So it's already kind of pointing us to the fact that Germany is a country where multiple languages are also spoken.
Yes, indeed. And I think related to that, immigrants are probably going to be the people who can read the greatest number of those languages. So it's perhaps even more accessible to certain publics, and people who are normally not excluded from advertising messages, perhaps messages in the public sphere, perhaps experience something of that kind of disorientation. Mm-hmm. I think that this idea of kind of an idea of Mikhail Bakhtin's of polyphonia, kind of a plurality of different competing voices, certainly something that interests Haacke. And I would just note that when he initially came up with the idea for the public intervention with the same phrase, he was simultaneously working on a monument to Rosa Luxemburg that also tries to bring together almost kind of contradictory quotes from Luxemburg and put them into public space as well. So definitely part of his sensibility.
And from what I understand, the languages change based on where the work is being presented.
Yes, correct. So there might not even be German. I guess you'll see in your negotiations with him whether or not he will put German would make sense for the specific site of the Busch-Reisinger Museum. But some American versions of it do not have German as a language on the poster. There was also a version, so even the documented version is actually two versions, because as I guess students of contemporary art history will remember, Documenta was held both in Kassel as usual, but also had a second platform in Athens. And the Athens version has a different set of languages that he's selected based on his understandings of what immigrant populations might be activated by it in each location.
Yeah, that. I only noticed it much later, John, actually, the poster that I had taken with me when it was on view here in Boston, and is now has been hanging outside my office since, before the pandemic, that it didn't have any German on it. And so Hans has agreed, at least to consider for us, for the Busch-Reisinger, to put the German back in, which means, of course, displacing, one of the other languages in favor of that. So we're still working out the details. But for me, obviously, because, the focus of the exhibition is also the origin of the work in the German context, that we also have that German there as well. And I'll be curious to see if he's interested in thinking about the languages here in Cambridge or the greater Boston area that are, our predominant immigrant groups here locally. So we'll see.
I think he definitely does try as much as is possible to take that into consideration. So I will look forward to seeing the slightly specialized, site-specific work that he ends up producing. And I think that's another thing that maybe we could just touch upon briefly, is the way that his works have this kind of perhaps sort of almost become site-specific. So it's quite common to not just with this poster project, but throughout his career, to another one of his famous works that people who might have studied in an art history class or maybe have seen if they've gone. Perhaps people might have seen it actually at the ICA Boston and Helen Molesworth exhibition on the 80s. This will have been his oil painting homage to Marshall Brotar's, which is an oil painting that he rendered himself of Ronald Reagan, juxtaposed against a photograph. And it is a kind of photo mural with a red carpet between them. And that photograph changes depending on where that work is exhibited. So the American version has an anti-nukes protest. The German version has a different protest of American missiles being held in bases in Germany. So that this idea of kind of becoming site-specific, having the same work morph or mutate depending on the specific circumstances, is something that's been a longer existing tactic within his output.
Now that's wonderful. And can we speak a little bit too? So for those of you who will Google it, we'll also put a few images of various iterations of the work on our Instagram post tomorrow as a follow-up to our conversation with John today. But there's another very prominent design feature in the poster, and that's the rainbow. And I wanted to ask you how you think about that. I think you wrote in your article, it could be interpreted as a kind of, feel-good sort of nod, but of course also the rainbow is associated with LGBTQ causes. Do you think that that's also possibly playing into the work?
Yeah, I think definitely. So it works as a graphic element. And I think in your posting, you've actually shown a slightly modified kind of extension of the work from outside of the New National Gallery in Berlin, where the rainbow becomes kind of the central element. And so I think
toggling out in front of the construction site, and probably still are, between these two different versions of the poster.
And so the rainbow becomes and I think in that one he fragments all of the different languages, and each one gets its own poster as well in the lower part. But I think most definitely understanding it is manifesting in favor of LGBTQ rights. It would be a correct way of understanding it. You could also even think about it kind of going back to a kind of older history of poster making. So if you think about like rock concert posters with rainbow rolls from like the late 60s, early 70s, that it has that kind of a sensibility as well. And so maybe kind of resonates with a kind of longer history of printmaking, print culture, grabs the attention in a provocative way as well, like regular advertising.
And I want to ask you a question now that maybe you may not be able to answer, and maybe it's one better asked of the artist himself, but in terms of, we're kind of tracking different issues around identity, and particularly German identity. And Hans Haacke, as having been born in Germany, but as having lived, so long in the United States, do you think that this plea, really, because that's, how I think we should interpret it, as it's literally plastered all around, cities outside of an art context as well, for a kind of tolerance of everyone, right? Beyond a kind of national identity that's kind of prompted the work in the first place, that kind of intolerance within Germany. Do you see that in any way related to his own transnational identity, or am I just wanting to make biographical connections there?
I think that's right. So he was actually not a U.S. citizen until after September 11th. So he spent a long time also related to this idea of being perhaps a kind of double agent, or somebody who was not totally part of the people, right? So his official status from, I think, probably about 1965 up through the early 21st century was as a resident alien in the United States. So surely he's very aware of what it might be like to have to negotiate with certain, obviously he's a white male European, so he's had a certain amount of privilege within his negotiations with the immigration system. But I think that's something that's there. He's also of a generation of artists, someone who's very successful in the realm of biennials, somebody who he was another perhaps double agent for Haacke was Okwi Enwezor, who of course wrote extensively about this kind of transnationalism, free mobility, kind of cosmopolitanism, all being the kind of ideal of the space of the biennial in the contemporary moment of post-1989. So I think some of Haacke's ideas are surely coming or relate to a kind of broader wave of thinking within the art world from the fall of the Berlin Wall onwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've seen that, going even, back to his work related to either, the Reichstag or the Venice Biennial and the German National Pavilion, those kind of direct interventions in a way into, these bastions of German national identity, which I assume is a part of the argument around, monuments and anti-monuments as well.
Yes, most definitely. Those are great examples. And what's often forgotten about that Venice work, Germania, where he breaks up the floor of the pavilion, is that there's also above the doorway a Reichsmark commemorating the 1990 reunification of Germany. So thinking about that same 1989 moment being perhaps not solely about all of us hugging each other and all being the people, but also about potential economic benefits that certain individuals are going to reap.
Yes, and indeed, indeed they did. Well, this has been really fabulous, John. The half an hour has completely flown by. So all I can say is thank you so much, and look forward to your book on Hans Haacke, but also to future conversations, and of course next year when the exhibition is on view, maybe we can even have you at the museum to take us through some of these questions, and hopefully we'll see Haacke's "We All Are the People." I always stumble on it, see, which is actually maybe part of the point, as you. And I'm always like, "We all are the people," installed at the museum, and to hear your expertise on it would be really great. So
yeah, I'd be delighted. And I'm actually teaching a course on public artworks in the spring semester. So I hope my students can come and visit you as well.
Yes, that would be great. Always welcome to the museum. So thanks again, John. And thanks everyone who tuned in, and join us next month for our next Busch Hall Conversations, which will be with another one of our wonderful local colleagues from MIT, Gary Van Zandt, who will be talking to us about the work of Ulrich Wüst, an artist whose work will also be featured in our exhibition next year. So thanks again, John, and happy summer, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.